Hi, it's Abbott Austin, and I want to say some things about fasting and self denial because another season of Lent is upon us. Recently, I started a website called the Structured Life Movement, and it talks about structures. And one example of structures are observances, like we do at Lent when we give up things or we commit ourselves to do some spiritual reading or perhaps to do some charity work, right? So we think of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting as especially practices during Lent. I want to say something about fasting, though. Fasting or self denial, more generally, are practices that I think we have a hard time understanding. And so sometimes you'll hear people even say, don't worry about fasting or self denial. Rather, do something positive rather than negative, right? Well, do things positive. I'm not saying not to do that. Definitely do so. But we need things, we need self denial, we need fasting. And when I put up the Structured Life Movement website, I tried to explain how observances or structures help the spiritual life, right? And I pointed out four ways in which they do that. So, in general, the way that structures, practice such as fasting, can help the spiritual life is by helping us to grow in virtue, right? In our ability to do the good things that lead to genuine fulfillment in our lives. Okay, and then there's four ways, though, in which identify structures can help with growing in virtue. And they all begin with P. So they're practicing, protecting, probing, and pointing. Practicing, protecting, probing, and pointing. So with fasting, the interesting thing with fasting is that it does all four. It helps cultivate the virtues in our lives in all four ways. So let's just go through that really quickly here. Let's start with the last one I gave, which is pointing. So, what I mean here is sometimes we observe practices or structures, observances, in order to remind us of things, to, in a way, point our mind toward things so that we keep them in mind, right? So, an example is simply like this habit I'm wearing. Uh, Monks or religious wear habits to remind them of their consecration to God. A married person wears a wedding ring, a wedding band, to remind that person of his or her marriage, her vocation, his or her vocation as a married person. Okay, well, with fasting, especially when we do it on Friday, what does that remind us of? It reminds us of the Lord's sacrifice on the cross, right? And we keep that in mind. So, this is one of the benefits of fasting. It keeps us mindful, or makes us more mindful of Christ's offering for us, his salvific offering on the cross. It also makes us mindful of our membership in the church and our identity as Catholics because we observe abstinence throughout Lent, abstinence from meat on Fridays, right? So, this is something that reminds us of our membership in the church as well. All right, so fasting or abstinence does that. Okay, so that's pointing. Then let's go to another one, probing. What do I mean by that? I mean that sometimes when we observe a structure, it probes the heart, it tests the heart to show what's going on in the heart. So fasting does that. How? Well, if you fast, sometimes you get grumpy or grouchy. You find you're out of sorts, right? So what is that doing? It's probing your heart. It's showing that you have become too attached to the comforts of food, right? You rely too much on food for your emotional well being and even more your spiritual well being, right? And so, what is going on here? So, you see that, right? So, if you see that, you get grouchy because you're giving up some food that you don't really need, you can do without for a time being, right? Some particular kind of food you might like, say sweets. Well, you'll live. If you don't have sweets for a day or for all 40 days, you're going to live, you'll survive. But we can get grouchy, right? So it's showing us something in our heart, an attachment to the comforts of eating, and we need to work on that. So we might think, well, this ain't helping because it's making me more grouchy. But actually, it is helping because it's showing you something you need to work at. And so work at it. Okay, then another P among the four P's is protecting. So structures can protect us from doing bad things, from doing things that aren't helpful for our conversion and growth in virtue. Okay, well, by not eating certain things, by fasting, or some other form of self denial, we're protecting ourselves from overindulging in those things, from becoming more and more attached to them, or from becoming or for staying attached to them, right? So we are protecting ourselves from overindulgence by fasting and self denial. And we do, in the United States of America, we do live in a comfortable society in many ways where we can become too comfortable, too attached to creature comforts. So this is important, protecting. fasting and self-denial do that as well. And then finally, there's practicing. Okay, so what I mean here is that when we observe structures, these observances, these practices, they are opportunities to practice the virtues or particular virtues, right? So when you put aside something like time to pray, right? Say I'm going to pray 30 minutes each day. Okay, that's a structure. You're observing that. But what it's helping you to do is to actually do the praying, right? That act of praying and to grow in the virtue of being prayerful, right? So fasting, what does that do? What is it an occasion to practice? Well, it's an occasion to practice lifting up your heart and mind to God. Okay, so we receive comforts and we receive nourishment from food. But when we step away from that, and perhaps we get grouchy and so forth, but it becomes an opportunity to lift our hearts and minds to God to, in a way, receive nourishment, to receive the consolation that comes from God alone. So we learn to turn to God as we should, to look to God as our ultimate goal, as the one we long for and desire and hunger for most of all. So that's another way, is practicing, being an occasion to practice that turning of the heart and mind to God in love and longing. So I hope this helps you. Again, practice like self-denial and fasting, they're not the only things we should do, but they are important and they have a certain practical necessity to them. So I encourage you in this Lenten season to make use of them in a prudent way, right? Not excessively or with too much rigor that would harm your health, but to employ them in a prudent way and to think about those 4 P's as you try to understand how this is helping, because it really can with God's help and God's grace. Have a blessed Lent. May God bless you.